Hi, friends. How are you? It's Wednesday, and we are back again for another day with AP Government. I'm so excited. We're moving out of argumentation today and into concept application. So, we're going to spend a little bit more time on skill today. Let's get started, shall we? And I'm going to be flipping back and forth between my screens today because I'm going to be doing some stuff live with you. Yay, live. We're so excited. Okay, you know who I am. We have lessons, we have things to do. You let your teacher look at this. We're going to move on. Want to remind you one more time that this amazing opportunity with Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of National Constitution Center. If you've never been there, it's an amazing museum. I love it, love it, love it. But this is for high school, college students, teachers. More information on the courts with an all-star cast of people who just are going to blow your mind about the 15 court cases in ways that you never even knew that it could be blown that way. It was just amazing. All right, so let's get to our questions. So I know, like, constantly things are going on around us as we come together for this 45 minutes, and it's this like protected space where we're talking academically. And then as soon as we walk out, boom, it's back to the real world where everything is crazy and it feels like it's on fire. So my friend Kelena asked a question about what is going on with the decision yesterday for the World Health Organization funding. Um, so the question is, what I mean, like, how are they able to stop it? Because this is something that the president can do. Um, the effect of it. I mean, there's a lot of things here, like in terms of why, et cetera. This is like, anything when a president is using their powers that have been handed over to them or delegated to them from Congress. They oftentimes have prerogative to do what they want with that, what they feel is in the best interest of the country. And here with President Trump and his knowledge of the situation in this case, thinks that this organization has some issues that he would like to pressure them, whether or not he actually takes the money away. Sometimes just pressuring is enough to get organizations and institutions to stop in their tracks and to rethink, especially if you're a large donor. So it seems that this is something that he is doing because he has some concerns about how the World Health Organization was handling information coming out of China, how much they gave credit to the things that were coming out of China. And that's all, like I said, that's political, right? Like those are going to be political issues that are going to be tied to the best interests of our country. But in terms of whether or not they have authority, that would be something that's handed over to them from Congress. Now, in terms of why, that's a great question that I'm going to ask you guys to spend time looking on your own. And I can point you in directions of resources, of places that I feel pretty confident when I go to them. But I'm always very hesitant to answer any why questions, because as soon as we're answering why, we're constructing an argument based on facts that we could be leaving facts out, and we could be adding other facts and putting more weight on some things. And that is kind of what I'm here to teach you to do on your own. So keep in mind that we could turn to something like the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Times um, to help us understand some of these things. Please remember the slide that I gave you a couple of classes ago where I made the recommendation that you have a balanced diet of media consumption, where you're getting something from the conservative side, something from the liberal side, and something right in the middle. And it's small amounts, and you're watching your sweets, right? You're watching how much political satire you're getting, or things that have been really, really highly refined messaging wise, because they're mostly going to be your editorializing. And allow yourself to let that story to develop over time. This is our obligation to being a part of culture of this society and being in a democracy, is that we kind of have to stay tuned a little bit. Does that mean we have to drop everything and spend time doing nothing else? Of course not. But check in 15, 20 minutes, look at your headlines, look into the articles that seem a little more interesting, and stick to the things that you trust. So next question I had from Emily, who had a wonderful question. And Emily, I'm not kidding when I tell you I didn't know the answer to this question. I had never heard this term before, So that goes to show you that learning is never done. It's a lifetime process. And I did some learning yesterday. I jumped right out of Twitter and onto Facebook. I have about 5,000 friends that hang out on Facebook on a protected private group that's full of AP government teachers. And I knew that someone on there would know, and they did. So my friend, Mr. Oglesby, living down in, oh my gosh, I think he's in Georgia now. He's been all over the country. Helped me out. He said that a 4x4 voter means that it's a way of referring to how many times a voter actually shows up to vote. So we're talking about presidential midterm. A 2x4 voter would be only voting in the presidential, I believe. Although I thought it was 1x4 only votes POTUS, but it's getting to how frequently you're voting within that 4-year time period. Obviously, the more often you're voting, the more politically engaged you are, the more reliable you are. And so the question becomes, do you want to target those voters who aren't showing up as often because they are a little less less known in terms of where they're going to go? But that's a great question. So thank you so much. I love that I learned something, and I enjoyed learning yesterday. So our warm up, I left you yesterday with a 2020 version of the FRQ. So that's missing the D point, even though yesterday I talked about our rebuttal and refutation. And today we're going to come back around and just go back to looking right at that 2020 prompt. So this one, and you guys, I had so many FRQs last night. It was beautiful. And can I tell you that you guys all showed high levels of mastery on the content. I saw in every single FRQ that I looked at, and I had seen all of the ones that had been tagged for me before I walked in today, and I think it was roughly 20 of them, that every single response showed a mastery of understanding the tension between the political branches, between president and we call it the unitary executive theory is kind of like the technical term that we use for the single executive, versus having the intra branch check that we see in a bicameral legislature. And I wanted to share with you some of the student samples because I want you to see that this is an argument, and that arguments are about having the most compelling position built on relevant evidence, and having that evidence connect cleanly back to support our argument. So I had two that went in two completely different ways. So Sarah here asked me if I could look over this, and both of them I picked because just at random, but both of them I think are full credit. There's a very beautiful, we start out here. Some may argue that the president is best fit to take action that the people will favor in case of a national crisis because they are one energetic person. Again, I'm seeing some of that language from the unitary executive theory, and they can act quickly. So I see a lovely position, repeating of the prompt, and some clean reasoning that I see naturally lends itself to our evidence. And then we get into, they are going to choose Congress. And most of you said president, which I'm not shocked, but they said Congress. Sarah said Congress. So the reasoning being that they are able to use a large number of senators and representatives to share and combine ideas that are closer related to how the citizens would like the issue to be solved. So thinking not there about urgency, but more about wisdom of our decision in terms of what is best. So beautiful goes in right into Madison. Again, we have to name our evidence to be able to continue. That's at identify. So identifying 51 cleanly, the legislative branch is the most powerful. There's so many people. Like we've got, I want to make sure I break this down. Identified in 51, described in saying that it's the most powerful branch of the government, and then goes on to elaborate on that with an explanation of Madison's theory here, because there are many people here. Now, that is not commentary, that is Sarah's, because Sarah is explaining to us the reasoning that Madison gives in 51 in terms of why they are the most powerful. Her reasoning will pick up in the next sentence. The members can use their extremely impactful role to respond to crisis, Beautiful. All right, then we move directly into the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. Some kids sometimes will ask me, like, do I need to know the clauses? Do I need to know the sections? No, not necessarily, but you should definitely know what what article they come out of. Like Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is President, Article 3 is the courts, 4 is the states, 5 is amending, 6 is supremacy and assorted things, and 7 is just we are signing our name now. So being able to identify roughly what, kind of like what chapter that it's in would be helpful. But Sarah goes deeper than that. She zooms in closer to her evidence to talk about Article 1, Section 2, granting the people of the United States the ability to vote for members. And the same thing with Article 1, Section 3, a minor factual error there because it's 17th Amendment, but she had it with Article 1, Section 2. So even though she should say that the 17th Amendment is where that comes from, it's okay. Like she had it on the first stab. And as long as you have if the points are on the paper, then you're going to get them, right? You don't have to be consistently right the whole way through. With an exception, you know, I'll put a caveat on that. Members are chosen by both the people and representatives. They tend to use the power to legislate by acting in favor of the constituents of their states. I see that's pulling language directly from her reasoning in her claim. So that's it. That's done. That's a 7 out of 7. Beautiful job. That was a very lovely read. Abigail, same thing. 7 out of 7, a little bit shorter. Doesn't mean it's better or worse. Just kind of the words that were necessary for the point to be made. So we see, again, our counter argument, although some believe that Congress can best respond in time of crisis. I see a position, I see the prompt, I see a because, right? And I would say the one thing that I think I pointed out to Abigail here is that naming something isn't necessarily giving reasoning. So instead of saying power of the purse, kind of suss it out a little bit for me if this were an essential component, which it's not to our thesis. So she goes on to say the president can better serve the needs during times of national crisis, period. And I know that she's starting a new sentence, but she is concluding this thought by giving reasoning the president can better respond because of the efficiency of one person, the ability to enforce laws. So again, we're naming our evidence here. Hamilton argues for a strong executive branch. He's having one person, like a monarch during emergencies, is more efficient. We have zoomed in close enough that I can see the thought of Hamilton in Federalist 70 without having to actually copy word for word what Hamilton said. And remember, we've talked about not using a direct quote because it depending on how long that quote is, and it just could potentially open a can of worms for you that I don't want to open. So I love that we have a nice paraphrase. It's a strong, clean paraphrase. I know exactly where we are in the document. And then we move out of that immediately into it takes too long. This is the reasoning. It takes too long for Congress to debate and pass a bill. The president can respond to a national crisis with quick decisions. Second point, again, naming our resource, Articles of Confederation. This is her chosen strand. Prove the need for an executive branch to enforce during times of emergency. That is a position that she's kind of throwing out there. So she needs to step closer into it to explain to me or describe what the executive branch was under the Articles of Confederation or what it wasn't. And that's exactly what she did. She said there wasn't an executive, there's no way to enforce laws. Perfect. Shays Rebellion, this is connecting external evidence. So this is actually a spare tire because she's giving me a third piece of evidence here. But she kind of just like obliquely, like she just name drops it, which she can do, right? Because this is just additional. So she here is relying on my knowledge of Shays Rebellion to make the connection. Like I have to think, okay, so Shays Rebellion was like a bunch of guys who are up there who are frustrated with debtors relief up in Massachusetts. They had assembled, they were frustrated with their property being seized, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that right there. She names it, she doesn't describe it, she doesn't explain it, but she can do that because she's already achieved the point for her evidence, B2 and B4. She continues on to complete that loop and saying that the articles, it's a response to Shays that the president couldn't do anything because there wasn't an effective executive, and it was part of the reason why. So 7 out of 7, right? There are longer responses on Twitter. There are shorter responses, and I'm going to continue to encourage you guys to grade each other, to give each other comments, to give each other props when you do well. I mean, except at some point, I have a feeling I'm going to get to the point where I'm going to have too many to respond to. And so that's when grading each other will be helpful. And of course, teachers, if you want to like take up the charge and help me give kids feedback, I'm totally down for that as well. Okay, so let's reflect back to what we talked about last class. We've already established the presidency. We know that it's one. We know that Hamilton had this vision of kind of like a pseudo king, right? And I do, and it's not wives' tales about, you know, the founding fathers having almost a crush on George Washington. They knew that George Washington was going to be the president. They kind of just, I imagine them sitting there, you know, batting their eyes at him while they're talking about the executive, because they envisioned him as being the best suited. I mean, he was a national icon. He was the image of America, of the United States at that time. And you know, today, like we see a lot of pictures of flags and stuff like that, that conveys national, like being patriotic and having nationalism. In that time, you would have bought plates with George Washington's likeness on it, or other types of, you know, cutlery, because he was, or other things, because he was it. He was the embodiment, the majesty. And they had this wonderful conversation about, what do we call the president? And of course, they're like, oh, I don't know if the sun is rising or setting, but I hope it's rising, and it's rising behind Washington's chair, because there was like a sun that was carved into the back of his chair. They had just this amazing reverence for him. And they did talk about calling him His Excellency. They quickly said, no, like, we're not going to do that. We can have a single executive, we can have prestige, we can have, you know, the honor and due respect that is due to that office, but we don't need to have like it be inherited like Hamilton wanted. So our single executive, as we know, is necessary to respond to our issues with deliberate and effective speed. And our primary restraint from yesterday is through regular elections every 4 years, which, again, touching back on yesterday, the 22nd Amendment putting term limit restrictions on it is going to alter the structures that keep presidents inside the lines just a smidge, and has never really been fully rectified, which is interesting. It's interesting. What are you going to do about that? I don't know. We talked about this guy, right? Unity, duration, adequate provision of support, competent powers. We need to have a president who can decide, be active, be secretive, and have dispatch, be able to send people wherever they need to go, to be able to provide for our public, our I just forgot welfare. Oh, help me out here if you, I can't remember. The common good, right? The public welfare, all those things. And then we have these formal powers that come out of the Constitution, and our informal powers, which we talked about last class. So this is kind of the bedrock of where we are today, right? The president is not, I want you to remember, first of all, the president is not the band leader here. The president has to be authorized to do things by Congress. And Congress, from time to time, will delegate powers to the presidency to do things in their stead, because it's not rational, it's not logical, it's not beneficial for Congress to be doing these things. And so when the president is doing all of these businesses, and Congress is in the business of talking things out, right? They deliberate, they negotiate, they collaborate, they compromise. You will find that if one branch is talking and the other branch is doing, that there will be tension. And that is our tension between our checks and balances. So much of what we talk about in this class, and in this unit in particular, is about that tension between the two. Some of them are carved out and delineated by Congress, or I'm sorry, by the Constitution. So anytime you see like a number there, we're talking about overriding a presidential veto by 2/3, that's a constitutional requirement. Consenting to a treaty, constitutional requirement. Removing a president from office, 67% or 2/3, that's a constitutional requirement. So many of these things are spelled out, and then many of them aren't. Many of them are outgrowths of informal party action, informal presidential action, informal congressional action. And again, We have a framework for understanding kind of when, like, who should be sitting in the driver's seat based on, and this is going to be interpretation from our courts, right? They're getting involved and they're looking into the Constitution when things are vague, because they are vague from time to time, and they're giving us a way for us to understand that. So let's get out of the words and into the numbers to take a look at how these things operate. So the first thing, vetoes. Presentment clause, Article 1, Section 7. It is the heart of the bill to law process, and it is eerily very short. I mean, really, it says got to go through both houses in the same form, and then it's sent to the president. So you have this most essential core action of government, which is passing laws, requires the concerted action, right? Action in concert between the House of the people, the House of the states, and the single executive. And they all have to agree. Of course, the person who has the most influence, theoretically, I guess in our view, is the president, because it's one person. And when a veto happens, it's very noticeable when those things kind of unwind. But the president can't do anything on the floor of Congress. They can't vote. They can't present legislation. They can't debate. They can't do any of these things. The only time that they're allowed to formally message Congress as a body is during the State of the Union address. The rest of the time, the president has to rely on structures that they have in place to persuade, but they can't force anything. They cannot force Congress to take a bill up or do anything. They can stop, right? So this is, vetoing is a fun word. I also think of negating. I think of voiding. Those are all synonyms for kind of what we're talking about with veto. It's passive, but it's thou shalt not pass, right? And so it's not just the actual act of veto that is persuasive. It can also be the threat of a veto that can be persuasive and can cause negotiation and compromise. So if we take a look there, you see part of Article 1, Section 7 down there in the blue, which is our bill to law process. But I love the data. I just think it's super interesting. The first thing that we notice is that there is a general, remember we talked about trends and patterns, right? I see a general trend, or I see both, right? Our pattern here is if we are comparing the solid black line with the checkered black line. And generally speaking, if we're looking for generalizations, the more bills that are passed, the more vetoes, right? Do you see it? I mean, there's some exceptions. We've got some stuff going on with Ford, right? We've got some weird stuff going on, along the way. But that's kind of generally, we can look at that exception with Ford and say that's probably going to be an outgrowth of reforms that are coming from the Nixon administration. The rest of this, that's our general kind of trend. We might be able to kind of look deeper into this and say, like, are there any patterns that exist in times of war? Are there any patterns that exist in times of great trial, emergency, so on and so forth? But we would have to be careful on any of those extrapolations, because the data doesn't tell us that. Like, that is an inference that we're making. So remember, there is a difference, right? When we're looking at trends and patterns, they have to be things that we can say that happen within the four corners of our data set. If it's anything outside of that, if we have to draw some conclusions, then we're inferring. So be careful. So does it cause tension? Of course it does. I mean, yes, right? We see, I'm sure that during Ford's administration, when there were 66 vetoes that happened in total, that was incredibly frustrating for Ford in his very short term in office. He was there for about 2.5, 3 years. That's got to be incredibly frustrating, because if you look around him, Carter and Nixon didn't have the same experiences when they held office. So, there's things going on that we can get into that we're inferring, but for sure we can see the tension. So I'm going to pull us back into some language here for us to look at, and you can go ahead and pause this really quickly. This is George W. Bush's veto message from a bill that is from way back when. I don't even know if all of you were alive when this was when this was vetoed, but it comes from HR 810. This is the Stem Cell Research Enhancement Act of 2005. So some background on this is that this was a bill that would allow and expand federal funding for stem cell research in medicine. And the breakdown point for George W. Bush was how those funds were used to promote different kinds of research activities. So these grants and aid, the issue here is, are we using them on embryos that have already been destroyed and therefore no future damage? There's no economic incentive to kind of go into medical clinics and gather this biological material to continue to have funding. And that was what, that was what this came down to for George W. Bush, was that he felt is that it wasn't biological material. Here we're incentivizing the harvesting of life for genetic research. And so we see that he makes that proclamation, right? He is going to stand up here and explain why he's creating tension. Did he threaten? Absolutely, you would bet it. But there's like an interesting thing here. It's 2005, slightly different time period. We haven't polarized as much as we see today in 2020. There was a little bit more support from the Republican Party because they controlled, and this is probably the most shocking thing to you, is that the Republicans control the House and the Senate at this time. So that to us tells us that there's some different things happening here, right? Like the president in the modern era, they've led proactive policy agendas. We know exactly what a president is about because we hear about it in State of the Union. It's the messaging power, and also in presidential party platforms. We also hear it whenever they're using the bully pulpit, whenever they're talking to the public, right? Congress, when they lead, which Congress has in the modern era largely deferred to the presidential's policy agenda. They come up with stuff proactively, but it's not to the same extent. So if they're going to lead, it has to be something that's really going to unite the party. It's going to animate like across party lines, some kind of issue that's important to them. And so we see here that during times of political division, presidents can use their veto power. They can even threaten to veto to get what they want, because it's such an expending of energy to pass bills. And Congress, if it's popular enough, because they have to have 2/3, that's a supermajority in both the House and the Senate, they have to be able to do that in order to override it. Now, here we see kind of maybe the origins of that big divide between conservatives and liberals, because what's interesting here is that the House they initiated this. It went back to the House of origination. That's the veto rule. It's got to go back to wherever it started. It goes back to the House, and then the House has the opportunity to vote again, and they have to have 2/3. Now, while we saw a lot of Republicans vote to override this presidential veto, 51, it fell short of the number needed to be able to successfully override the president and therefore then send it off to the Senate for them to do the same thing. So we're starting to see this division in terms of, or like what our understanding of the Republican Party, again, getting back to how parties realign around central tenets. We see some of that happening here. And, it's a really interesting question. And would we even, what would this happen today? And I, of course, can't answer that question. That's just speculation. All right, is there another way for a president to indicate a break with Congress? And of course, they can threaten the veto we talked about. They can use the pocket veto, which only happens whenever Congress is out of session, which is rarely in the modern era. They have a tendency to use this thing called, it's a little trick that they have in their rules. It's called the pro forma session. Every 3 days, once they are supposed to have adjourned, and adjourn means like we're done for business, we've shut up shop, we've put, draw the blinds and we're out. When they adjourn for more than 10 days, the president can then exercise a pocket veto, and the bill dies. It just withers on the vine. It never goes back to the House of origination. He doesn't have to give a reasoning why he has vetoed it. In addition to that, if there's a vacancy, they can also do what's called a recess appointment. So the use of pro forma sessions in between sessions, not in between terms in Congress, has been used to keep Congress open for business and prevent things like pocket vetoes and recess appointments. And it's been endorsed in the Supreme Court. You also have presidential signing statements, and those are, we're going to look at those. And the final one is executive order. So that messaging, that directing, the animating instructions of how to proceed. So looking here more at kind of presidential signing statements, these are optional documents that give direction and vision to the way a president would like legislation to be enacted moving forward. We can see that this has been around for quite some time. It's not a revolutionary instrument, but what has become interesting is how they have been used. In the past, oftentimes a president might use a PSS to say like, hey, look, this is on my agenda. Yay me, we're doing it, right? We're doing all the things, let's go. They've also used it to clarify ambiguity in the bill, which that happens. I look at legislation. I'm sure you guys have played this game when you were younger. Mad Libs. Do you remember that? Where it was like no adjectives, no verbs, no nouns, so on and so forth, and you fill it in with your friends. So that's legislation in an essence. And the reason why that happens is not because Congress is falling down on the job, but it's intentional. Like I said, passing legislation is difficult, and it involves compromise. And when it's highly technical, in addition to that, there will be spaces left in the legislation that allows it to be filled in through something we call the regulatory process, the rulemaking process, so that those who are in the bureaucracy, who are subject matter experts, can lend more detail and can flex through changes as necessary without having to go all the way back to start by rewriting legislation. So that's sometimes he or she might want to say, I would love to see this happen with this legislation. So this is the direction we're going to go in. And he is going to give that command, and then he's going to send it off into the sunset, and the bureaucracy will take care of enforcement for him. And then the final thing is, and this is our new innovation, declaring constitutional concerns. This is really the one that seems odd because the president can veto something. So why would we use a presidential signing statement to say, I don't think this is constitutional, if you could just veto? And the answer is, and you know it, it's about politics, right? If there is something that is very much so supported by your constituency, and you feel like you are forced to pass it because it is a feel-good measure, but you know that it may not be beneficial to your agenda, this might be a good way to get around it, right? So here is a sample from the Detainee Treatment Act of 2005. TLDR, John McCain passed a law that said we're not going to be mean to people who are held, who are designated as enemy combatants anymore. We're not going to waterboard them. We're not going to torture them. We've listed things that we said are on the do not do list. And the president signed it into law under much pressure from the public and from the Republican Party and from John McCain. And remember, he's going to be running for office in 3 short years after this. And what ended up happening was Bush signed it into law, but he felt as if it was an unconstitutional infringement on his powers as commander in chief. So he, in essence, said in the presidential signing statement, I don't have any intention on fulfilling and fully executing this because I think this is a constitutionally dubious law. Interesting. Of course, then they come back and say, well, we're not going to ignore it. I mean, we're going to do stuff with it. Okay. So final thing, war powers resolution, or another great example of war powers resolution. Know that war powers resolution is what we call a legislative veto. It is, and I think I move on in this one. Yeah, kind of a little bit. It's a form of legislative veto. A legislative veto, I said a couple classes ago, is it's language inserted into a bill that enables a committee, enables a House, enables Congress to exercise oversight powers. And in the oversight powers, if they feel as though in their investigation that the law is not being enforced the way they want, they have the right to go back and to strike actions without having to send it back to the president to be signed, like in a normal legislative move. So the War Powers Resolution is probably the most famous example of this. It goes back to 1973. And of course, we're thinking about not Watergate, we're thinking about Nixon, and we're thinking about our, secret wars in Laos and Cambodia. And also, using the CIA to fight the Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong and all those guys. And now I'm like walking through. It's been a minute since I've done that part of U.S. history, so go ahead and correct me. It's all good. But this issue was that the commander-in-chief exceeded their powers of the armed forces, and that Congress didn't feel as though they had a mechanism that could restrain that exercise of power sufficiently. Of course, we're not declaring war, and we know why we don't declare war, right? We don't want to declare war because declaring war says I endorse this behavior, and it also expands the president's powers. I think I have a slide about that coming up next, so I'm going to wait. But in this maneuver, what ends up happening is if a president sends troops anywhere and there's just a threat of hostility, he has 48 hours to inform Congress. He has to tell them why, give them constitutional justification, tell them how many people are going to be there and how long. And then Congress has 60 days to do a positive action. They actually have to get things together and pass affirmatively funding through both houses. If they do nothing, that means that those troops need to be withdrawn. So it's a form of a legislative veto. And it was expanded in 2001 to deal with stateless or adversaries and terrorist organizations. So again, why not just engage in law? We have given, after World War II or during World War II, we gave the president huge powers in nationalizing the economy and all other kinds of things that are still on the books. And that if we were to do that, we have some trepidation about doing that very casually. So it also allows Congress to avoid those kinds of things. So patterns in the treaty versus executive agreements, again, same thing. We see more executive agreements being used. Why? Because treaties have to be taken up to the Senate, and the Senate has to advise and consent on it, which means that we're getting involved in politics. And I don't think I have to go much further than remind you of Woodrow Wilson's efforts with 14 points. The final thing is that the president has, and we'll talk more about this when we get into the bureaucracy, but the president also has people who work for him. I know that you guys know this, and almost all of them at the utmost levels require an appointment, and require a hearing, and require confirmation out of the Senate. There is one agenda, and if we kind of look and we go right to the middle here, this is the branch, the office, the bureaucracy that is closest and most loyal to the president's agenda. And as we move out, that's where Congress starts to intrude on having some authority, some regulatory authority over those different agencies. And the furthest one being regulatory commissions are the ones that are in theory the most independent of the president, although they're still dependent. There's one that's loyal, and that's the White House office. Right? They don't have any approval from Congress. And so that means that the chief of staff, the White House counsel, that's his personal secretary for the person, not the office. The counsel, the lawyer for the president is over in the office of legal counsel, which is a sidebar bureaucracy. And that's just for the president, like the office of the president. But the lawyer for the personal lawyer of the president is the White House counsel, press secretary, office of legislative affairs, national security advisor, national economic council. These are individuals who are pulled together to help the president with his agenda. All right, and we get to our confirmation process, and we know that, again, this requires assistance from the Senate, and that we have seen a very interesting shift in how the branches are interplaying with that confirmation. And the reason why is, and I love this cartoon to be able to help kind of hammer this home, is that the younger the person is who's sitting on the court, the longer they stay. So it becomes a way for a president to cement their legacy. It's very much so helps fulfill policy goals for presidents in the long term. All right, and we'll talk about this later. So I want to now go and turn to the free response question for the whatever this guy is called, content application. Remember our verbs: identify, name, define, describe, explain. We talked about that at the top again. And here it is, if you want to like look closer at what it is. Here's our point acquisition flow chart. So here is how I am going to advise you to tackle this. It doesn't matter what it says on the paper. My advice is that you should identify, describe, and explain for each point. Identify, do nothing but underline whatever that actor or action is. Describe, what are they doing? What do you see them doing in the prompt or in response to the prompt? And then explain how those actions address a specific prompted scenario or address a specific concept, depending on what's been prompted. So, you know, it's all about how does A impact B? How does B and A impact C? That's it. And if you identify, describe, and explain on all of them, you are going to increase the likelihood that you're getting those points. Now, some of you might be like, this seems like overkill, and that's not what the College Board is asking us to do. I get it. I'm giving you advice, right? So this is how I would hack this. Why am I telling you to do this? You have 15 minutes to get 40% of your grade in 3 points. That's it, right? So if you want to increase the likelihood that you get each and every single one of those points, you need to make sure that you are identifying, describing, and explaining every single time. You're putting spare tires down. You're doing more work than is necessary because it is such a tight point acquisition. You have no room for a misstep, none whatsoever. So this is in our document here, and I'm just gonna like roll through this really quickly. I have spent too much time talking about other things. So I want you guys to go ahead and take a look at that, and you can go ahead and pause it for a second as I'm gonna pull up the prompt and give you an example. All right, so I gotta stop this, stopping, new share, and I am down here, share. Okay. Hey, we're back. So this is last year's, right? You will always have a prompt. It is about 75 to 200 words long. If you look at it and you're like, I don't know what the Johnson Amendment is, guess what? That's okay. You don't need to know what it is, right? You are looking for, what is this? This is a special interest group, right? It tells you that. You are looking for some kind of action, right? Okay, Congress passed a law called the Johnson Amendment. What does it do? Restricts money, religious leaders from contributing, from doing social issues, right? So then on this day, they're saying, let's do an act of civil disobedience and let's talk about the moral qualifications of candidates for office, right? They give you everything that you need to know in that prompt. So don't panic and say, oh my God, I don't know what to do here. I've never heard of this. I don't have any contextualizing information. Remember, what you're there to do is to explain how different actors in the policymaking process are going to interrelate with the powers and the influence that they have. That's it, right? So I'm going to show you, you know, they tell you in the first one that you should describe. I want you to describe and explain, because we are doing more than we have to, right? So what can Congress do? Congress can pass a provision of the Johnson Amendment, right? Now, we talked a lot about, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about active voice. Make sure that your actor is the subject and that your verb tense tells me exactly who's doing what, right? And they go beyond. So I like this sample because the student is actually elaborating, right? They're restating the provision can allow leaders to speak for or against certain candidates, and can only restrict contributions of money, right? So they are identifying an action that can be done, right, in the future, pass a law, pass a provision, right? And they're explaining how, this is an explanation, how this would work, how this action would have any impact on this specific scenario. Now, another thing that I want to point out to you is that you need to show evidence, you need to show contextualizing information from the prompt. So here, I see Johnson Amendment twice. I see religious leaders. I see certain candidates. I see contributions of money. That's all information that's gleaned from the prompt that shows that you have rolled your sleeves up and you are working directly inside that prompt to pull information out. Okay, so you have to roll them up. Are you with me? All right, in the context of the scenario, explain. Remember, we're going to describe and explain because we're doing more work than we have to, because we want to get that point. We want to get those points. We want to get them all. All right, so what are we describing? An action described, so we're looking at partisan, how does party get involved in Congress doing stuff? So we say the new provision can lead to partisan divisions. We're repeating our prompt because more conservative or Republican, and I love this. You know why? Making sure that the reader knows that that there is a difference between the two. Remember when we talked about that conservatives is not the same thing as Republican. All right, they are two different. This is ideology, this is party. You can be a conservative and be in a different, oh my gosh, and be in a different party. I can't believe I didn't turn my ringer off. Woo, it's live. All right, so Democratic lawmakers will not agree. So I see that there's a clear statement here in terms of how, and we're not agree with this new provision, right? Where we see active voice, that they're doing something, and they will tell us exactly why, because of church and state, which comes right out of that prompt. Our final thing, the alliance defending freedom, right? We have to go back in and say, what the heck is that? That is our special interest group. So we need to identify that that's, or at least know that that's what's happening. So why might they argue their constitutional rights are threatened, right? So they can argue, again, repeating our prompt, they're being threatened by the Johnson administration or by the amendment because, right, we're explaining, we have to connect, close that loop. Organizations cannot publicly support a candidate, therefore it limits their free speech. And then here we are, we're closing the loop. The government cannot, limit speech unless there's a clear and present danger, which in this case there's not. Now, this is a little bit of a spare tire here because we're a little bit off in the weeds. Like the government can limit speech under certain contexts, but we have a nice position, right? We have a nice explanation as to how the special interest group, we see the action, we see a repetition of the prompt, and we have very solid reasoning. That is our explain. We would want to go back in and probably give us a description of that. And in that case, this helps a little bit. Okay. Now I'm rushing, and I know that I'm rushing. It's just another day where I spend too much time talking about things, just way off in the weeds. So back to our PowerPoint here. You guys are going to have another one from College Board tonight to practice with. So take your time on it. They're very quick. Time yourself 15 minutes. Go ahead and pull this down that helps you with the questions that you want to ask yourself as you're going through this, making sure that you've got like, am I getting through causation? Am I getting through processes? Am I explaining? And then you've got your questions to check yourself as you're going through it, which is really critically important. If it helps you, pull this down to make sure that you're thinking about identify, describe, and explaining each of the points. I personally love when I'm identifying to underline it so that I can say that's where it is. I named it. Now I'm going to tell you all about it. And so now we have we're wrapping it up, right? A newly elected president faces a Senate controlled by the opposition party. Which of the following presidential appointments is most likely to encounter difficulty with Senate confirmation? Think about it. We've got a president, we've got a divided government, we've got appointments. All right. Secretary of Defense, Supreme Court Justice, Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and Ambassador to Germany. You know this. You know this. This one, you know it. Supreme Court Justice. This is like, why? Because it extends the president's legacy by protecting their policies well after a president is out of office. 2, in selecting members of the White House staff, the president primarily seeks people who A, give the White House ideological balance, B, are personally loyal to the president, C, have extensive government experience, or D, will help the president develop a good working relationship with Congress. Why would you want that? It's B, personally loyal, right? Wonderful. Okay. We did all the things. We are good. we will continue. I was supposed to talk about refutation. That's a mistake. Good job, Ms. Hitch. We did our walkthrough of the content application FRQ. It was super brief. I will spend a little bit more time at the top walking you through it to make sure if you would like to take a picture of it, send it to me. I will be more than happy to break it down in class. You have a USA Patriot Act concept application FRQ. Enjoy this FRQ. It is just lovely. And that is pretty much it. Remember, cb.org/tech. Let us know if you need assistance. Thank you for watching. You guys are brilliant. There are my lovely resources so that I'm staying honest. And I'm going to say goodbye to you for now. Bye-bye.